Okay.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear that okay?
Yep.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you everyone for coming along today. Should we wait or should we go straight into it?
Let's go straight into it.
Great, thanks Lizzie. So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming along today. I'm talking today with Elizabeth Anya-Petrivna, who's the exhibition producer for the National Trust of Australia. So first off, I'd like to do the welcome to country. Glen Iris City Council acknowledges the Boonwurrung, Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nation as traditional owners and custodians, and pays respect to the elders past, present and emerging. So we've got a lot to talk about today, so we'll sort of get started. So first off, I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about the introduction to the National Trust's work in Victoria. As we know, they manage built heritage, house museums and preservation, landscapes. They campaign for preservation of sites and also produce publications. So they started in 1956. As a community-based organisation, they're not part of the government, and so work with partners to deliver their mission to inspire the community to appreciate, conserve and celebrate its diverse natural, cultural, social and Indigenous heritage. And here's a picture of one of their properties, Bowen Park Mansion. Now, Lizzie, as you know, the collections are a big part of the work that the National Trust do. So would you like to speak a little bit about the sorts of collections that you have?
Yes, I would. I'm on Wurundjeri country, and I too would like to pay my respects to the members of the Kulin Nation and their elders, both past, present and emerging. So the collections that the Trust is custodian of are incredibly varied, from medicines and pill makers from Dow's Pharmacy, to photographic collections from, the silent movie era of Hollywood, and all the way through to examples of needlework and costume and fashion that we're going to be focusing on today. It presents quite a challenge, needing to be quite a generalist, I suppose, in regards to sort of how we research and look after our very, very varied collection. And of course, it takes a lot of resources. But fundamentally, the collections are, the kernel of those collections are the domestic spaces, the houses, the buildings that the Trust, opens to the public. So most of our collection is out on open display. So when you visit a Trust property, you kind of get to see our collections.
Great. Here's a picture of you working with some of the pieces in the collection, in fact.
Nicole, can you just double check with your screen sharing, because the slides I don't think are coming up on my side of things.
Okay.
Technology, huh?
Is that any better? Can you see it now? Sorry, I'll just try again. Apologies.
That's okay. There we go.
Great. Okay, I'll quickly, apologies for that, sorry. Great. Thank you for pointing that out, Lizzie. How embarrassing. Okay, so tell us a little bit about what's in the collection. I think it covers from about the 1850s to the 1970s.
Pretty much, that's the span of years. We do have some pieces that that are a little earlier. So in many ways, it does reflect the European settlement of Port Phillip and Victoria. So we have items that date from the late 1830s and 40s. The core of the collection, though, tends to be 1850s and 60s. and then 1880s, and then the Edwardian, and then the 20s and 30s. In some ways, it kind of follows the peaks and troughs of the economic prosperity of the colony and, of course, post-Federation. So it's just interesting in what people have kept, and it sort of tends to correlate. I don't think I'm kind of seeing this as a causal thing in any way. It's just an interesting correlation that it seems to kind of follow that that sort of peaks and trough. We have some strange anomalous items in the collection. So some, 16th century strang work, which was an interesting type of knitted technique with some uncut jewels in it. So it's a kind of a miser's purse or a pocket. We have a 1720s mantua, waistcoats from the 18th century. These things were brought to Victoria by their owners or descendants of, and interestingly, these older pieces do tend to have family histories actually sewn onto them. So they become really interesting artefacts that are still within the province of our kind of collecting policy, because they do tell a story about Victoria, about and to a larger extent the migration to Australia, they just are quite fascinating objects. But we're not very strong into the 20th century. I think the collecting kind of waned a little bit as resources, managing a collection, any collection, but a costume collection takes vast resources. So the bulk of the collection came in the 60s and the 70s. And the Trust has been collecting ever since, but not on that scale.
So most of what you have is women's wear, I assume, but you also have menswear, children's accessories, jewellery.
Yes, absolutely. The children's wear is just wonderful. It's actually a big part of the collection, really, in comparison to, I think, the menswear. We don't have a lot of examples of menswear, but we've also got pattern pieces. So many christening gowns. So I was doing some research on those, and then once you sort of scratch the surface about the provenance, the make, the handmade lace, they themselves tell quite an extraordinary story, even though we have racks and racks of christening robes. And
so the garments.
Sorry?
I was going to say, so the garments and everything that you collect is connected to the history of Victoria and the people here and Australia, a migrant story as well?
Yes. Yeah. So that's pretty much, you've summed up our collection policy, what we accept into the collection.
It's good to have a policy.
It sure does, because
you can't collect everything.
Oh, I wish. We sometimes get some amazing things, and it's like, oh, how am I going to justify that to our committee? It doesn't tick any of the boxes. And we are really, we need a lot more space to care for the collection. We have been in temporary storage now for about 10 years. So
it's always about managing resources, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the big dream is to have a textile resource centre, a costume and textile resource centre in some way, where it's a storage facility, it's a research facility. There's a place for public programming. There's a small display space, and we'd love to partner with our vintage clothing volunteers and sort of have the same premises. That's the dream.
Because you're lucky that you do have a very big volunteer base at the National Trust. I volunteer occasionally as well, and you do have a lot of people who work with the costume collection, which is great in conserving it and looking after its needs.
Yes. People do give generously of their time, and it's probably not as glamorous at times that people kind of, sometimes you'll open boxes and, gasp and ooh and ah, and, that's always wonderful. But I think sometimes collection management, the storeroom, you walk in, white walls, grey boxes, grey baked enamel, shelving, lots of white tissue. And
you're saying it doesn't always look like it does here with a nice rack of
no, it doesn't.
Okay, so Lizzie, I first met you about 20 years ago, where you were already working for the National Trust. So how long have you been with them for?
I think it's about 22 years.
Yeah, and your role has changed quite a lot over that time.
It has.
It's expanded and grown.
And also kind of my research focus has refined as well. I know that I knew when I was kind of entered the museum industry or field, and that I was interested in domestic spaces. I was interested in houses. I was interested in those sorts of social history aspects. And that even though, galleries and museums are wonderful, I kind of wanted to see myself very much in the house museum. And so I was fortunate enough to begin cataloguing the collection with the National Trust when they were reviewing their collections and their database and digitising their paper-based records. And was offered a role, and it's changed and evolved, and more and more projects come up. And I was fortunate enough to receive a scholarship to go to the UK to do the Attingham course, the Attingham Summer School, that focused on the English country house mainly, and met these wonderful people who all had very specialized research interests. There were very few generalists. So I kind of felt, wow, this is really sort of something that I hadn't really sort of considered in an Australian context, I suppose, about how to kind of really specialize. And I'd always been interested in historic dress and historical dress, and that sort of kind of just focused me in on looking at textiles and historical dress, just to sort of refine and as I said, focus in on a research topic. So that was a good eye-opening career moment for any of you out there who are budding curators and museum professionals.
It's true, we do have to be generalists a bit in Australia.
Yeah.
So Lizzie, I'm curious about your education and your background, because there's not a lot of places to study historical costume in Australia. When I think I first met you, you'd come down from Sydney.
Yeah. And I got a role with La Trobe University as a research assistant just as I was finishing up my undergrad, and I was cataloguing for Professor Marilyn Lake the collection, the Women's Liberation and Lesbian Archives, for a publication that she was working on with her PhD students. And one of her PhD students introduced me to the museum studies course. It was sort of part of the funding that they received meant that they could send me off for training. So that was just a revelation, and I hadn't looked back. So
you did that at La Trobe?
Yes.
Great.
And then Deakin University, so of course museum studies, which working full time, I sort of spent a long time getting that degree, because you've got to put food on the table for the family.
It's hard when you're working full time.
It is. But Deakin are fantastic in how they manage to accommodate people who are already working and gaining sort of the credentials, the qualifications. And when I decided to specialise a little more, I enrolled at RMIT to do a master's with Robin Healy, and it was a few of the thesis reviews that it was suggested that I upgrade to PhD. So the PhD research has been a big component of, contributes a lot to my understanding of the Trust's costume collection, because they're very much in tune, they're very much aligned. I'm looking at curatorial practice and the curation of historical dress, and my case study is artificial flower makers in Melbourne in the 19th century. So I'm looking at attendant crafts and a micro-historical approach. And so how do you bring a micro-history out into a kind of into an exhibition format? How do you communicate that? How do you collect it? So that's it in a nutshell.
Fascinated. I'm really looking forward to reading your research. So the National Trust has, as you said, it has a lot of very good, especially Victorian, late Victorian garments. This is one of my personal favourites, which was on display at the NGV a few years ago at the 200 Years of Australian Fashion. It's been displayed here beautifully. You can see that there's a lot of care been taken into this garment. Tell us a little bit about the conservation and the way that you sort of treat garments and the process that they go through, because you do a lot of exhibitions and things which are quite demanding on garments, on historical garments, especially of this age. It can be quite challenging to display safely.
Yeah, we haven't displayed a lot of 19th century fashion that often, and it does require a lot of infrastructure. So I think the last time we did it at scale was for Love, Desire and Riches, which was the weddings, history of weddings exhibition, and spent many months carving body forms to fit the body, to fit the actual cut of the gown. We had the services of a conservator who advised on the underpinning, and also did some work strengthening things like the waistbands and other areas, so that the dresses could actually be put on a body form
so
safely.
They're all supported.
Yeah, as much as we could. I mean, it's when you've got all this much drape, I love that the NGV uses those wonderful Kyoto mannequins. If in an ideal world, it'd be great to have them. So that's also been the reason why we have tended to focus on the 20th century for a lot of our exhibitions. We've looked at the 20s and 30s. We've looked at the 70s, and we've have done a suite of exhibitions on the mid-century, so 50s, 60s as well, because we have the mannequins that can be used. The examples of dress can withstand a little bit more of being on display. And one advantage of putting on exhibitions, not only does it raise the profile of the collection, but it also means that I've got a very good case to ask for some funds in the budget to employ a conservator to do some work. So for our Nightlife exhibition, for instance, we worked with Kylie Howe, who just did an amazing job creating supports for some of the very heavily beaded evening gowns, and advising us on which could be put on a body and ones that couldn't. So we had some cases made that so we could display some of the dresses flat. So in some ways, even though it is a risk putting a dress on display, it also then means that you do get some resources to do some work on it as well. So
beaded 1920s dresses are particularly challenging to display because the weight of the beads, especially the glass beads and the heavier beads, damages the delicate silk fabrics that they were made out of. So
yes, indeed.
Because they are very simple structures, they're very effectively displayed flat in a display case.
They are. But, conservation science is also, changing, and, research is ongoing. So a lot of the sort of materials that can be used for fusing and those sorts of things. There's far more possibilities now as well, just with advances in science and conservation, so I hold out hope that one day, something miraculous will happen and we can put all those dresses on bodies safely.
It would be good. It would be good. They do look beautiful displayed on bodies.
Yes, they make sense that way,
They do. Now, you have many other sub-collections really within the collection, and one of the collections you have is the Fabian Archive, which is the work of Nellie van Rysselt. Yeah, an embroiderer who worked in Melbourne in the 50s and 60s, I think.
70s, yes.
70s,
yes.
Yeah. So I believe you have about 60 objects in the collection relating to the Fabian Archive.
I don't know off the top of my head, maybe a little bit more, because we have her paper-based archive. So in true haute couture fashion, because she was trained in that system, she was very protective of her designs, because she would conceive of these embroidery designs herself, and she actually hid them away, and convincing her to donate them was tricky. And her daughter Iris eventually donated them to the National Trust, but she was very sort of protective, and rightly so, and she trained in both the Netherlands and in France, in Paris, in a technique called moulage, which was dressmaking formed on the body, so on a body form, so lots of drapery. But then she also was a trained embroiderer, I think from her family legacy. I think there was a history of it in the family. And she specialised in Cornelli work, which you can see an example here in chenille, which she would use a Cornelli machine to trace out the pattern. She'd use the butter paper, trace it out with pinning it using one of those wheels and chalk, and then she would use the machine, and that created the basis for her designs. She would then hand embroider over the top of that with beads and sequins and raffia and all sorts of different materials. They're absolutely wonderful, wonderful, pieces, very textural. And so we have her archive of designs, not only her samples that she would show people like Hall Ludlow or
Robert Fritz
Slav, exactly. And they would say yay or nay, or change this, or we need a different colour. She'd also have her inspiration images. So you can see here she has this clipping that she's taken from a magazine, and that's been the source of her inspiration. And each page also has her label, so she's really marking out that this is her work. And we also have her butter paper tracings. So, her working pieces. Some of those pieces we've been able to match up with actual designs that are still extant. They're still, and some of them we have in the collection. We an incredible team of volunteers. Libby Howcroft and Nance Howen in particular, I've got a shout out to them, did an amazing work sleuthing, hunting down examples of Nellie's work for an exhibition that was staged at Como in 2005 called Fabulous. And so they were able to find examples in people's wardrobes. Many of those have now come into the collection. So the Fabian Archive, we've got the paper-based archive that she's carefully catalogued all of her designs. We have her working pieces of butter paper and other bits and pieces, little samples of beads and so on. And she was also very good at ensuring that every piece that she made that appeared in the press was photographed, that she got a copy. And so we have these photo albums of prominent women wearing her gowns, and then we have some examples of those gowns. For example, Robert Fritzlaff's 1962 winning gown of the year. Yeah.
What a wonderful resource.
It's amazing.
I hope that you get researchers coming along and asking to have a look at it. to explore this, because embellishment and decoration was such a feature of fashion, especially in the 60s. I've had a lot of very dramatic gowns from this time, and I'm wondering which ones I've had, because someone like this, you wouldn't necessarily, she wouldn't put her label in the gown. You know, the designer might have it, so you wouldn't necessarily know that she'd done the work, but she has particular techniques that she's very popular with. Like I'll be looking out for these ones, for example, the Cornelie chenille work. Now, you mentioned earlier that you've done a lot of exhibitions, and I love seeing the National Trust collection on display in exhibitions. So here's a photo I took from your Nightlife exhibition at Bowen Park a few years ago, with one of those gorgeous beaded 1920s dresses that probably had to be stabilized to be on display here. Mm-hmm. They're quite difficult, but they are so dramatic when you sort of see them. And in more recent years, I've noticed that with your exhibitions that you're collaborating with other creatives as well. And so for this one, you worked also with Stuart Walford. Would you like to talk about that collaboration?
Oh, I would very much. It was extraordinary, and I think, and it's absolutely the highlight of my professional life to see a museum collection gain a kind of relevance and a sort of become a catalyst for creativity. I think that's what I'm trying to say. Really, to sort of watch someone become so inspired and so excited by the collection, and then kind of creating a new iteration, creating a kind of new vision, a new idea that's kind of that sort of springs out of the history of the piece. And with the Nightlife, we kind of wanted to sort of, one thing that I found quite fascinating, and it's also all the work that I've done with the Miss Fischer exhibitions that I've worked on as well, is how certain eras sort of are imagined, you know, that people, that carries through into the future in this way, that there's a lot of kind of ideas about what the 20s were like or what the 30s were like. Some of it is based in historic fact. Some of it is a lot of it is nostalgia, but it is this imagined idea. It is this this kind of you know, it's a fantasy, really. And it means that things like Miss Fischer can be successful because everyone seems to love the 1920s and 30s as far as you know, an era for fashion and dress. And
very glamorous time, very, you know, beautiful luxurious fabrics, gorgeous flowing silks and chiffons, and I love it.
Same. And so I wanted to play around with that idea. You know, what is this fantasy, and how would someone from now interpret those ideas? And Stuart is an extraordinary stylist and creative practitioner. I don't know whether you've been following him on Instagram. He's been doing these most amazing lockdown extravaganzas, taking runway haute couture looks and reimagining them out of kind of craft materials at home. He's just a genius. So I asked him to think of the 20s and 30s in this kind of contemporary way. Like if he had to style, we called it styling the times. So it was sort of this kind of conceptual idea. So he used some pieces from the collection that were what we call our IP collection, so our interpretation collection, that is our primary significant collection. So these were pieces that we collect for research purposes, or for dressing our houses, if we need props. So it's like a prop collection, really. So it meant that Stuart could dress the model Curtis here in some of the pieces, not many, they're very few, but then he combined that with contemporary designers, people like Nevenka, Kalauri, Sick, antiques and so on. And they also lent pieces that were then displayed in the exhibition and styled with the historical pieces. And that's when we could use pieces that were a little bit more significant because they were on body forms. But part of it was very much also to kind of create a photo shoot. Yeah, he did an extraordinary job. So I hope I've explained that okay and don't sound too
great.
confusing.
No, it's wonderful. So here's another exhibition that was in recent times, Fashion Quarter at Como House, which I really enjoyed. In particular, these photos are mine, and I particularly was pleased to see this gown on the left because I didn't realise that you had such a wonderful example from the 18th century. But you also collaborated with this exhibition with a number of stylists, including, again, Stuart,
Yes.
who also produced some really interesting things for this one as well.
Yes. So the idea kind of, I guess, evolved out of Nightlife and working with Stuart and just how successful that installation was, and how it reframed the collection. A colleague at the time we were talking about it and just how wonderful it would be to sort of have stylists come in and work with the collection, because styling is and the way that a look is created, it's very much about how fashion and dress is communicated to the public. So it's kind of a remove from the maker in many ways. It's a remove in the sense that it's another selection. It's an oft overused word, but it's another curation. It's another interpretation. And I was really interested in this idea of how dress and fashion is interpreted and how that imagery is made. So Fashion Quarter, we invited 4 artists and stylists to respond to the collection and to respond to Como and come up with scenarios with narratives that they told. So again, it really unlocked aspects of the collection that were quite moving and visually I found quite emotive. Like the Tweenie installation that Stuart did, for instance, he worked with a filmmaker to create a short clip, and it was about the power of dress and fashion and beauty and those aesthetics. And he had the Tweenie maid, who was the between stairs maid, finding these beautiful pieces of clothing and just being really tempted by them and wanting to put them on. And again, it played around with this I guess, poetic conceit of the fact that we also open up boxes in the costume collection and we can never wear these garments. They'll never be on the body again. So that urge, that desire was really kind of played around with his installation. And I just thought it was just magical. And so these photos, of course, this is a fancy dress that the model is wearing, but she's not wearing. She's actually got it against her body, and it was all fully supported, and she had to stand very, very still, and it didn't touch her body at, like any skin or anything. And so the whole series of the fashion shoot, that's how it was done. And we just, the photographer, Olivia Tran, quickly took the photos, and then it was on to the next. So, it was the closest we could ever get to getting these on a live human being ever.
Yeah.
So that was the magic of it.
Well, these sorts of collaborations also can broaden the appeal of the collection. You can reach different audiences that wouldn't traditionally come to a museum, or who might see historical fashion as a bit sort of old and out of date. It's making them relevant again.
What is it that Jean-Paul Gaultier... Oh, sorry. Wasn't it what Jean-Paul Gaultier said, that a garment goes to a museum to, fashion goes to a museum to die?
And then he works on his own exhibitions, doesn't he?
Love it.
Yeah. So you mentioned Franny Fischer, of course. We all love Franny, and the National Trust has been a big part of her story, both in providing locations, seen here with Labassa, and also with the wonderful exhibitions for the TV series and then later the movie. So Franny, of course, the Miss Fisher exhibitions aren't National Trust costumes, but you were very involved in them. And she wears a mixture of historical garments and also modern garments that have been made up perhaps out of vintage fabrics, different things. There's a lot of historical accessories and things like that.
Yes, yeah. In particular, the series, the costumes were designed by Marion Boyce, who's won all these amazing awards, and rightly so, for the costumes, and supplemented, of course, by her incredible personal collection as well. So, a lot of the look of Franny is very much, I've interpreted with Marion Boyce, a labour of love, I suppose, because they are just so amazing.
As brought to life here by Essie Davis in the role.
Yes, yeah. And look, it is another way of bringing our houses to life, and also to kind of, I guess, look at that way that that heritage is incorporated in popular culture as well, and the popularity of the era. Sort of touched on that a little bit earlier, and just how the spaces can be created into these wonderful immersive environments, and you can hang out in Aunt Prudence's stately home, surrounded by beautiful clothes,
which we know as Rip-on-Lee.
Yes. And the Crypt of Tears film, that has just returned back from Leeton, so it travelled to New South Wales, with unfortunately COVID hot on its heels, because the moment that they opened up, they had to close again, and that we opened, and we tried to open twice, third time lucky with the exhibition. So it was a real challenge, as we've all been challenged by the past 2 years. And yeah, it's just, I just sort of find it quite wonderful now that the Miss Fisher Modern TV series is out, and I know that Every Cloud have put together a small display, or actually not that small, actually, in the Sofitel, Collins, I think it's Collins Place. There's a gallery there, and they've put a display of the 1960s fashions from Miss Fisher Mod.
Really fun fashions.
Yeah, for the Spring Fashion Festival. Yeah, so if anyone's interested, pop along there. I think it's running for another week or so. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the pandemic. Just before everything sort of closed up, you did a wonderful program with the Grimwade Centre in Melbourne University called Costume Lab. And I'm a bit sad I had to miss out on this one because I was working on my thesis. But tell us a little bit about Costume Lab, because I had very good reviews from this one. The people who went along really enjoyed it.
We spoke earlier about the fragility of fashion and how to look after it, and the resources required, and how sometimes there are garments that we may not ever really be able to put on a body form or display in any way that would that would show its original intent. I guess in a museum environment that's difficult anyway, because clothing needs to move to make sense. It's the way that the light, we talked about beadwork, to have that read properly, it has to be moving. You have to be dancing. You have to have the light flickering off the beads and the sequins, and, just sort of on a body form being very static, it's like, it's kind of undermines the sort of intent of what it means to wear a garment like that. And the Trust has a huge collection of early 20th century pieces, Edwardian pieces, and also late 19th, that are probably out of all of the costumes in the worst condition, but are also so frou-frou, so over the top, so sumptuous, so amazing, so all those furbelows and frills and beads.
They deserve to be seen.
Oh, they're just wonderful. So the idea at one point was that we would display some of those sort of kind of flat or in boxes, or, you know, or, I mean, we're just sort of brainstorming what to do. And one part of it, there was one dress in particular that was kind of the inspiration initially for this idea, and it was a dress that was worn to the coronation of King Edward, and it was just shredding. It was just splitting. It's hand painted. Rose panels were all splitting. The incredibly lush, goldeny, buttercuppy, buttery lining was just crushed, and pieces were falling off. And so the idea was that if we were going to do this exhibition of Edwardian fashion, that we would have a conservator working on it, so we could actually show it to people rather than not, because it was just such an important piece to be part of that story. And it kind of morphed into this idea of actually running a conservatory lab and having this conservation in action experience, which is hugely popular in art galleries. Often, this was pre-COVID, they'd have conservators working on paintings in gallery spaces, but this was a little bit more of a involved, I suppose, installation. It was almost part performance, because we had students from the Grimwade Centre actually work on pieces. So we had professional textile conservators and a research student similarly working on a preservation needs analysis for the collection. And so that's a wonderful document that we have that's going to kind of direct our future, the future of the collection and its conservation needs. And the students condition reported over 300 objects. They created, you can see one of the students here creating supports for the shoe collection. They also created inserts. And we turned the music room into a laundry. So a lot of white work, a lot of children's wear, blouses, shirts, those sorts of items that had been assessed by the supervising conservators were then bathed and washed, padded and dried, and that was extraordinary. So there were essentially sort of 4 or 5. There were 5 stations around the house at Labassa, and visitors moved from station to station and learnt about different aspects of textile conservation.
Sounds wonderful. I hope you do it again. I'd love to see it. As an aside, I did a little bit of conservation work with some costumes at the Arts Centre last year, working on a particular collection and making supports for shoes and things. They're incredibly important and incredibly laborious and time consuming, but once you've got them, they help the costume sort of survive and look after itself. So
indeed,
I've got a couple of questions that people have sent through, so I might sort of ask them at this point. Someone's asked if you can talk about do you have a favourite piece in the costume collection, or maybe a current favourite?
Oh,
it's hard, isn't it, to pick favourites?
It is. There are a few. I think, well, I've mentioned the work of Nellie Van Rysort. I think I'll always have that sort of sub-collection close to my heart. I think one of my favourites is a day dress that came from the salon of Mrs. Eales, who was a Collins Street dressmaker, who followed a kind of Charles Frederick Worth style template as far as her sort of business practice was concerned. So, she had a dark room, or salon de lumière, where you could go and sort of view silks and trims under artificial light to make sure that you looked resplendent in the ballroom, because of course gaslight and early electricity changed the kind of temperature of the colour, and so if you thought you were resplendent in purple and you entered the ballroom, you would probably turn brown. And you wouldn't want to be brown. You would want to be purple, but that was what happened under gaslight. So, and she also travelled to Europe. She'd always place a notice to say she was travelling, and she would bring back samples, and her workroom would recreate them. But this was a dress that was created early on in her career, well, her business here in Melbourne, it's a day dress that's got wonderful little spots on it, little hail spots, and it has a fascinating provenance. I had a conservator have a look at it, and she discovered that there were seeds, grass seeds, in the hem.
Wow.
And so she carefully picked those out, and I sent them to the herbarium at the Bock Gardens to be identified. A lot of them were bindi eyes, but one of the seeds was a wallaby grass that I think tended to grow in central Victoria. And it kind of was very evocative to sort of think of where Alice Kresick actually, who wore the dress, walked, and how, she grew up in the Hawthorns, at the very first house in Hawthorn, and would have sort of walked down to the Yarra there,
in her beautiful gown,
in this wonderful day dress. I mean, it was a lovely day dress. So I made contact with the family, and they provided wonderful images of Alice, and a wonderful history. She actually featured in a Martin Boyd novel. She was Aunt Albania in the novel The Picnic. And I thought there was a nice kind of serendipitous moment there. She's got grass seeds in her dress, and she features in a novel called The Picnic. I just, there was something really nice about that.
It is. It's beautifully connected.
So I think at the moment that's one of my faves.
Okay.
But I could go on.
Yes. Now someone else has asked, do you have a favourite National Trust property for displaying exhibitions? So quite a lot happens at Rip-on-Lee, but you've also exhibited at Como and even a little bit at Labassa.
Yes. And Bowen Park, of course.
And Bowen Park, yeah. And I was at Ballura the other day, which currently has a costume exhibition, not open to the public yet, but hopefully. Ballura is beautiful.
Oh, isn't it just?
Mm.
Yeah. Look, I don't really have a favourite venue. They all have their strengths and visual splendour. Yeah, look, I don't know. I don't know whether I can really answer that success, in any way. Displaying at Rip-on-Lee is great because of the vastness of the spaces. So you can really do something dramatic there. And I've really enjoyed doing more larger scale kind of installations. So for the Super 70s, we put a UFO in the front room, and we had Mark Wozniak create. He was the scenographer for Super 70, so he recreated pretty much the House of Merivale. So I think it's the kind of the scale that we can dream for Rip-on-Lee because of the size of the rooms. And then when you look at a space like Como, the spaces are smaller, they're more intimate. You can tell a different story. The proximity to the garments is different. The number of garments you can accommodate in a space are also sort of reduced. So it's sort of, you can see how the curatorial eye directs the visitor in a particular way in a smaller space, whereas a larger space you can do that spectacle, and you can do a little bit more of a kind of reveal with a kind of trail through smaller house spaces. Displaying at Labassa is always really interesting because you're competing with those incredible interiors, which is your background, Nicole.
I know, I do love Labassa, and Labassa's in the background of this picture we're looking at here with the 1890s gown as well.
But it's great to see the 19th century fashion, particularly the 1890s pieces in that context, because they would have been worn in these types of rooms. Well, some of these garments, these elite garments, would have been worn in these types of rooms. So you can kind of sort of, see what the visual competition was like,
See them in context. Wouldn't it be lovely if you had like a nice modernist house in Beaumaris or South Yarra, Robin Boyd or someone that you could put on a lovely display of mid-century fashion, 50s and 60s, 70s or something?
Well, if someone has a modernist house they'd like to give to the National Trust, I don't think we'd say no.
Yeah. Now, I've got another question as well. And a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, please send them through, because, I love hearing what Lizzie has to say. So someone asked if you've got some tips for storing beautiful antique costumes that you might have at home. So the hobbyist.
Yeah, I'm always a little bit. Oh, sorry, Nicole. Can you repeat what you just said? Last sentence.
She's wondering if Lizzie has any tips for storing and looking after beautiful antique costumes we have at home.
I'm always a little bit sort of reluctant to comment too much without seeing the garment or knowing what it is, because these are fragile, precious things, and each item will require its own specific conditions, I suppose. But keeping it in an acid-free environment, ensuring, depending on if it's silk, ensuring that you aren't using buffered acid-free tissue, because a too alkaline environment will be damaging to the silk. Of course, clothing is made up of lots of different materialities. It's not just the fabric. It's not just one type of fabric. There's the metals. There's, it's the boning. There's, we have some garments that have crin, so horsehair inside them. They all kind of would perish at different rates and need different care. And
then there's elements like humidity, temperature control,
yes,
pest control.
Yes, pest control, which is again an issue. But often, if your environment is clean and it's fairly stable, you're not making it very attractive to pests, who often, things like silverfish like a little bit of humidity and that sort of thing. So it is just maintaining a stable environment, dry and clean. And if you are seeing active deterioration, then consult a conservator or a professional and get some advice. Yeah. Sorry, I was sort of being a bit oblique in how I was answering that, but it's just a really tricky question to answer.
It's a good answer, Lizzie. I get asked this all the time, and it depends very much on what you have and what the conditions are, and also what the condition of the object is, because if something is already showing deterioration, like you say, you need to manage those, you need to stabilize them. I had a lady showed me a 1850s christening gown the other day. It's a relatively easy object to store because it's made of cotton. It's already in very good condition. It's been nurtured and looked after probably for most of its life. So, but not everything is like that. Not everything is as straightforward. So that's all that we have. But if anyone does have any more questions or anything, we've got a few more minutes. Please send them through. Lizzie, I've really enjoyed talking to you. I love hearing you talk about the collection and feeling your passion, how engaged you are, and all the exciting things that you do with the collection, which is really great. One of the things, as you know, I would love to see the collection more accessible through digitization, so that more objects were available online, because a lot of museums these days are doing that. And it would be wonderful to be able to see more of what you have, because I know from my experience with your collection and seeing various exhibitions over the years, you do have so many wonderful things. I mean, here's some pictures of 1920s shoes. Actually, maybe a little bit earlier, 1918. They're gorgeous. I love them.
Yes, I love. Yeah, they're quite wonderful. So I think I would love that. And when we've had that ambition for a really long time. We are finding that we are moving in the right direction. I think we've upgraded our database capacity to a really fantastic system. So that's one actually giant step in the right direction, because it'll mean that we can sort of start kind of creating more accessibility, just being able to search the database.
Great for researchers as well.
Yes, yeah. The number one thing at the moment is to rehome the collection. So that's what we are focusing our energies on. And it would be probably we'll discuss this as well, a very kind of logical thing to be able to sort of photograph and document as things were being packed up and relocated, you know, to minimise double handling. But again, it's the resources with some of the garments, and you know, not being able to put everything on a body, and how successfully you can photograph it. You know, I mean, I guess, and that's why when things go on exhibition, it means that we can photograph things properly because they've been put on a body. But even just sort of being able to take those museum shots of items in boxes, that might just be what we may be able to accommodate, because it would be a expensive and long-term project. But it certainly is on the cards, and we are moving towards that. Yes.
Do you have any other plans for the collection, like any upcoming exhibitions?
Nothing set in stone, so I probably shouldn't sort of tease you all with possibilities.
You could drop us
Nonetheless,
hints.
we're always dreaming of future projects.
We won't hold you to them.
But one thing that we are doing over summer in Geelong is we're having a little bit of a reprise with the Miss Fisher costumes. So we've got a program called the Summer of Mystery, and it celebrates female crime writers and characters in crime, and looking at historical crime as well as just historical settings, so on the whole. So we're going to sort of use some of those 20s costumes from Miss Fisher, but supplement it with information about crime writing, with readings, with soundscapes, with story starters, and with crime. So we'll have a murder mystery. So it's sort of costume in support of another idea, I suppose, with that exhibition. So that opens on the 5th of January down at the Heights in Geelong.
Oh, I'll be there. That sounds fantastic, Lizzie. I love that idea.
And the Heights is so Miss Marple, you know, it has this real Agatha Christie energy, I feel. So it's an amazing house to dress.
I haven't been there, so it's always nice finding new National Trust properties to explore. So we don't have any more questions, but we do have a couple more minutes. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Goodness. Oh, it's just been so far-ranging. We've just sort of talked.
We've covered a lot of ground.
So much. We sure have. I can't believe we've got a few minutes to spare.
I know. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, Lizzie.
Oh, I've loved it. Thank you. And really had a great time. And Nicole, you ask such great questions, and thank you for preparing those and the slideshow. So very much appreciated.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Glen Ira, for inviting us.
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful way to spend the late morning.
Well, anytime. I'm certainly up for this. So if anyone's interested, if I can give just a little bit of a plug, I'm doing a couple of talks for Glen Ira. I've actually got one tonight. Oh, hello, kitten. Who's that?
That's Misty, one of the 3 cats.
Beautiful. I have 3 as well, but they haven't made any appearances, probably just as well. But yes, I'm doing a talk tonight for Glen Ira on Coco Chanel, which accompanies the NGV exhibition. And of course, it's not part of their official program, but I'll be talking about the life of Chanel and her contributions to fashion, how important she is. A little bit of a contentious subject. So she didn't live a perfect life. She was a flawed human being like most of us. And I've also got a talk coming up on the 14th of December for Glen Ira, where I'll be talking about 1970s fashion. So I'm actually going to be using some of my photos from the 1970s exhibition that you did, because there was so many fabulous. I particularly loved the House of Maryvale room. It was so beautiful. So it was nice to know that the late departed, sadly missed Mark was involved in that, because it was beautiful. All the gorgeous menswear. The 1970s is so fabulous for 70s menswear, and especially the House of Maryvale, really great label. So I loved that. So I certainly encourage you to do more in that area. But yes, so I think we're just about out of time. So if there's no other questions or anything, I think I might thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, everybody else, and we'll finish.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
Bye,
a lot.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.